Have you ever stopped to think that a simple phrase, written at the right moment, can prevent someone from taking their own life? Well, it is. While everyone is racing to find complex solutions, lives are being saved with a piece of paper and a few words. Does that sound far-fetched? Then you need to know this story. It begins like any other. A customer walks into a restaurant, orders a coffee and sits alone, carrying a silence in his eyes that no one else notices. No one except the waiter, an ordinary man, without a cape, without powers, but with something that is sorely lacking in the world today: sensitivity. What he does next goes against all logic, against the rulebook of social indifference, and against the idea that a stranger can do nothing for you. This video is not just another moving narrative. It is a slap in the face to those who think they need money, fame, or status to make a difference. Because what you will see here is the brutal power of an invisible gesture, an act that was not posted on social media, that did not seek likes, that did not ask for applause, and yet it changed the fate of an entire life. If you've ever felt alone, or if you know someone struggling in silence, this story will resonate with you. It will teach you, it will touch you, and above all, it will give you something you may have lost along the way: hope. Best of all, you'll leave this video knowing exactly how to apply this to your own life. Stay with me until the end, and I'll show you how a napkin became salvation. And what's more, I'll reveal the secret the waiter kept hidden for years, which could completely transform the way you see the people around you. This isn't a story just to watch, it's to feel, and who knows, maybe even to repeat. It was a grey, cold afternoon in New York, the kind that seems to silence even the sound of car horns. Amid the hustle and bustle of people, a man entered a small restaurant in Brooklyn. His threadbare coat, unshaven beard, and eyes half closed with melancholy hinted that there was more to it than just a hunger for food. That solitary customer seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. No one noticed his entrance, except for a woman sitting near the window who briefly caught his eye. Even so, he went unnoticed by most, like so many souls who walk the streets unseen. With slow, almost shuffling steps, he chose a table in the corner, far away, as if he didn't want to disturb or be disturbed. The cozy atmosphere of the restaurant contrasted with his deflated expression. He ordered coffee and a simple dish, but what he was seeking there was more abstract than nourishment. It was, in fact, the unconscious need to feel some kind of connection, perhaps a spark of hope, or even a sign that he wasn't completely alone in the world. The waitress who initially served him didn't notice anything strange. She smiled, took his order, and left as usual. But it was when a more experienced waiter named Michael approached that something began to change. Michael, with the wisdom gained over years of observing faces and silences, immediately realized that the man wasn't there by chance. Something in his withdrawn posture, in the way he stirred his coffee aimlessly, revealed an anguish that couldn't be expressed in words. It was as if he was screaming inside, suffocated by the loneliness, the fear, the insecurity that consumed him. The waiter, who was not just a server, but a true observer of the human soul, felt an impulse rise within him that blended compassion, empathy, and the need to exercise the power of kindness. And that was when the story began to unfold. Even if the customer wasn't aware of it, every detail, from the background music to the small conversations at neighboring tables, seemed part of a scene carefully crafted by fate. Life sometimes presents its most important chapters subtly, and that's exactly what happened there. In that ordinary restaurant, where an ordinary man was about to experience an extraordinary moment. It's curious how the greatest encounters aren't announced with fireworks, but rather with silences that speak louder than 1,000 words. The client didn't know it yet, but that day, until then lackluster, would become the turning point in his entire journey. It all began with the simple act of sitting at a table and ordering a coffee. This small, seemingly banal gesture would be the first step in a long and surprising emotional journey. An adventure that would require resilience, courage, and above all, trust in something greater. The universe, in its mysterious wisdom, seemed to have conspired for that moment. It was the beginning of a process of overcoming, a subtle call to transformation. And behind it all, the attentive gaze of a man who saw far beyond the surface, already glimpsed, without saying a word, the need for a gesture that could change things. Michael wasn't just any waiter. He'd served a bit of everything. Stressed-out executives, noisy families, silent couples, broke artists, and even celebrities fleeing paparazzi. But his true specialty was seeing what few others saw. As he balanced plates and took orders, his sensitivity took over, sniffing out emotions, capturing silences, interpreting glances. When he spotted that isolated customer in the corner, something inside him awakened, like a keen intuition that whispers without warning. Michael realized immediately there was a deep sadness there, but not just any sadness. It was the kind that camouflages itself with politeness, that thanks you with a smile while crying inside. He didn't know the man's name, nor where he came from, but he recognized his pain as if it were an old acquaintance. He felt the same vibration he had once experienced when he himself found himself broken, exhausted, and lost among the shards of his own history. Michael approached the table with light steps, as if he didn't want to invade, just to welcome. There was no need to say anything yet. All he had to do was observe. The customer kept his eyes fixed on the coffee, as if searching for some answer. Between his fingers, the napkin already showed signs of unease, folded and unfolded, a reflection of the anxiety consuming him inside. The waiter noticed all this within seconds, and instead of hurriedly moving away, as many would have done, he decided to linger for a few more moments. The wisdom he had accumulated over the years taught him that sometimes a glance held for a few seconds can offer more affection and understanding than 1,000 words. He also knew it wasn't about intrusion, but about humanity. And in times when everyone is in a hurry, stopping to notice someone is in itself a revolutionary gesture. It was in this brief encounter between two strangers that something invisible began to form, a tenuous thread of connection built on empathy and silent respect. It was striking how the surroundings seemed to disappear for Michael in that instant. The side conversations, the clinking of cutlery, the aroma of hot food, everything faded into the background. All he could focus on was the man's aura of suffering. Something told him that if he did nothing, he would miss a rare opportunity to plant a seed of hope where there was only loneliness. And Michael was no longer a man to let such opportunities pass him by. His journey had been marked by loss, insecurity, and moments of darkness, but also by small lights that helped him through each difficult phase. And now, before him, there was someone who perhaps just needed a spark of love, kindness, or perhaps a dose of inspiration to keep going. It was then that, between impulse and reflection, an unlikely yet intentional idea began to form. An idea that combined altruism and emotional intelligence, and that would soon take shape in a gesture as simple as it was powerful. As he walked back to the counter, Michael felt a slight discomfort in his chest, as if something demanded to be done right then and there without delay. It wasn't just any discomfort, but a restlessness born of awareness and a genuine desire to be useful. He remembered a line he'd read years ago in a book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. When we are no longer capable of changing a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. That echoed powerfully in his mind, and he understood that faced with the pain of others, his mission was not just to serve dishes, but perhaps to offer a spark of hope. He took a clean napkin, took a deep breath, and in his firm handwriting, wrote something brief, but loaded with meaning. The words weren't chosen at random. They came from the soul, not from reason. He didn't introduce himself, didn't explain anything. He simply let the note rest there, carefully folded, next to the customer's cup, like planting a seed in the desert, trusting that the rain will come. The gesture was small, but its intention was immense. It was a silent letter, a message to the soul of someone who perhaps was about to give up. The message simply said, "I don't know what you're going through, but I know you're still here." And that's already a victory. Someone believes in you even without knowing you. Please don't give up. Michael placed the note with the delicacy of someone touching an open wound and walked away without looking back. He expected no thanks, no recognition. He knew that the true value of kindness lies precisely in not expecting anything in return. It was more than a gesture. It was a silent vow of faith in the human capacity to rebuild. It was the purest manifestation of the power of kindness. At the same time, it was an act of courage, because demanding compassion from the world when one is suffering is natural, but offering compassion when no one has asked for it requires a rare kind of bravery. There, on that simple napkin, rested the essence of everything that still makes humanity worthy. The ability to care for others, even in silence, even in the dark. It was a reminder that words carry weight, and that when spoken at the right time, they can save lives. Across the room, the customer still kept his gaze lowered, distant, as if he had forgotten where he was. But there was something shifting in the air, as if the universe were about to offer a new route. As the waiter walked away, he barely noticed the small piece of paper beside the saucer. The coffee was already growing cold, but the tension within him remained warm, alive. It was as if the soul were exhausted from carrying so many thoughts, so many what-ifs, so many fears piled up with no escape. And it is precisely in these moments of internal collapse that a message can be like a breath of fresh air in the midst of a hurricane. Michael knew this. He himself had sat in chairs like that, silently begging for a sign. That's why he wrote. That's why he dared. That's why he let love speak through his handwriting. And while the man hadn't yet read the note, something in the air was already changing, as if time had stopped for a moment, waiting only for the next page to be turned. Because what came next, he would never forget. The customer took a while to notice the note. He was absorbed, lost in thoughts that hurt more than any physical wound. His fingers drummed on the tabletop, his mind wandering between failures, debts, broken memories, and unanswered questions. It was as if he were about to disappear right there, not physically but internally. Then his eyes finally fell on the folded napkin, placed so subtly that it seemed to have been left by fate itself. He picked it up suspiciously, thinking it was a note from the restaurant or something ordinary. However, as he unfolded the paper and read those handwritten words, something inside him snapped. It was as if time stood still for a moment. A lump formed in his throat and his eyes filled with silent tears. That note said exactly what he needed to hear. No elaborate speech, no pre-written phrases, just a raw, honest truth. Someone saw him, and that for someone who had been feeling invisible was like a rebirth. The impact came not in the form of euphoria, but of shock. He leaned back in his chair, took a deep breath, and placed his hand on his chest, trying to contain the avalanche that was beginning to crumble inside him. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: connection. That small piece of paper carried more than ink and cellulose. It carried empathy. It carried love. It carried the possibility of reconciliation with himself. It wasn't just a message. It was an anchor cast into the turbulent sea of his soul. For the first time in months, he felt he wasn't alone, that perhaps there was still humanity in the world, that perhaps there was still a solution. Those words touched a deep place where no therapy had reached, where no friendly advice had found a home. It was as if a timid light had been lit at the end of a tunnel that was too dark. The note didn't say who wrote it, but that hardly mattered. What mattered was the silent miracle he had just witnessed, the rebirth of hope. The customer remained there for a few more minutes, as if trying to absorb every inch of the message's meaning. He didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or give thanks, and in fact he did none of those things. He simply closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel a rare, almost sacred gesture. Inside him, the gears began to turn again. An old memory surfaced. His mother saying that sometimes God manifests himself in the little things. He'd always disbelieved that, until now. He glanced around, discreetly searching for the waiter who might have left the note. But Michael had already returned to the counter, serving another table as if nothing had happened. This only deepened the mystery and the gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he felt an urge to do something for himself. Maybe read that book that had sat on the shelf for months. Maybe call someone he hadn't heard from in ages. Maybe try again. The note didn't solve his life, but it lit a spark. And like every good story, that spark was about to ignite everything in a transformative way. As he left the restaurant, the cold New York wind hit his face like a kind of alarm clock. He walked aimlessly, his eyes still watery and the napkin carefully folded in the inside pocket of his coat. It was as if he carried a map to a place he hadn't yet known, but needed to find. The dilemma now was no longer survival, but deciding what to do with this new chance that had been handed to him in such an unusual way. Life, which until then had seemed like a narrow corridor with no exits, now revealed a glimmer of possibility. He knew that returning to the same habits, the same destructive thoughts and the same isolation would be easier. But something inside him, stronger than the pain, more insistent than fear, began to speak louder. The seed of change, watered by the silent generosity of a stranger, was germinating. And with it, a kind of courage he thought extinct was born. It wasn't the courage to face the world, but to face himself, to look into his own eyes and say, "You still have value." He arrived home, threw his coat on the sofa, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the emptiness of the room that seemed to echo his loneliness. The silence inside was almost deafening, and yet there was something new pulsing in the air. The napkin was placed carefully on the dresser, like a daily reminder. He read it again, as if trying to absorb every layer of those words. He began to reflect on his journey, the moments he had given up trying, the bridges he had burned, the dreams he had shelved. And there, in that moment of introspection, the true dilemma arose. Stay where he was or try something different. Different was frightening. It required resilience, initiative, emotional intelligence, and a dose of humility to acknowledge one's own mistakes. But the repetition was unbearable. Living as he had been living was like dying slowly. And that's when he realized, sometimes fate offers us a silent choice, and it's up to us to decide whether or not to listen. The napkin wasn't just paper, it was a crossroads disguised as a note. With his mind racing and his heart pounding, he opened his desk drawer and took out an old notebook. It was dusty, filled with blank pages and some scribbled with forgotten ideas. He decided to write, without filters, without pretensions, just to pour out everything he felt. The pen ran across the page as if it were alive. He spoke of fear, of the insecurity that paralyzed him, of the regret that crushed him, but he also spoke of hope, of the desire to start over, of the spark that a gesture of affection had ignited. At the end, he wrote a sentence in large letters. "If someone believed in me without knowing me, who am I to give up on myself?" He closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and for the first time in months he felt light. Gratitude welled up naturally, followed by a kind of confidence that comes from within, almost like a silent prayer. It was the beginning of a decision. That would change everything. But to fully understand the power of this choice, we must know the story the waiter was hiding within himself. While the customer was experiencing internal turmoil caused by a few words, Michael continued his shift as if nothing had happened. He waited tables, cleaned glasses, took orders, and smiled with his usual professionalism. But inside, an old movie was playing again. The truth is, the act of writing that note wasn't random. He knew exactly what he was doing because he'd been in that man's shoes. Years before, Michael had faced the collapse of his own existence. He lost his younger brother in an accident, was abandoned by his wife months later, and, lacking the strength to start over, plunged into a seemingly endless grief. The only thing keeping him going was his work at the restaurant, where he pretended to be fine while daily fighting the urge to disappear. Until one of those dark days, someone left an anonymous phrase under his locker door. It was simple yet powerful. "You don't have to win today. You just have to keep going." That saved him. And ever since, he promised himself that if he ever had the chance, he would return to the world, the gesture that rescued him from the abyss. Most people who passed Michael at the restaurant couldn't imagine the depths that lay behind that man. With his soft voice and attentive gaze, they simply thought he was friendly, solicitous, and helpful. Few knew that he carried within himself a veritable library of experiences marked by pain, overcoming, and discoveries about the human soul. It was in his darkest moments that he developed a rare ability to perceive signs that no one else saw. Over time, he began to notice the subtlest details: a customer who ate too quickly, a woman who always returned to the restaurant on the same day of the week, sitting alone at the same table, a teenager who always ordered the same dish but left half of it. To many, this was irrelevant. To him, it was language. It was a way of hearing what wasn't being said. This emotional intelligence made him unique in that environment, and it was based on it that he perceived the lonely man's pain that day, because he knew from experience how loneliness can scream even in the midst of a crowd. Michael's secret wasn't just the past he hid. It was the conscious choice to transform his pain into a tool for healing. He knew he couldn't save everyone. He also knew that many wouldn't understand his actions, but he didn't do it for applause. He did it with purpose. That was where his wisdom resided. In every message he left, in every word spoken with intention, there was an invisible current of love, altruism, and compassion. He wasn't a hero, nor did he see himself as one. He was simply an ordinary man who decided to exercise his humanity profoundly, and in doing so, he touched lives quietly but permanently. The napkin that day wasn't the first, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. For Michael, that restaurant was more than a workplace. It was a fertile field where he planted seeds of kindness every day, never knowing when or how they would sprout. But he believed in the power of small things, and little did he know that at that very moment, one of those seeds was about to blossom into something that would change the course of everything. The following days were not easy for that client, but something inside him had already changed irreversibly. The message on the napkin didn't erase his debts, bring back those who had passed, or resolve all his existential dilemmas. But it was like a spark that lit a lamp in his inner darkness. From that night on, he began making small, different choices. Nothing grand, nothing spectacular. He started by waking up a little earlier, opening the apartment windows, letting the light in. He resumed reading a book he had put down months ago, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. Then he wrote a letter of reconciliation to the brother he hadn't spoken to in years. It was one step at a time, like someone learning to walk again after a long fall. That note awakened in him the ability to recognize his own humanity, and with that he once again believed in the possibility of starting over. Every action, no matter how small, became a silent celebration of life. The impact of that message wasn't limited to the personal realm. He began to see the people around him differently. He began to observe, listen, and perceive. He noticed that the building's doorman had been looking downcast for weeks. Instead of ignoring him, he offered a friendly word, a hot cup of coffee, and a sincere smile. He found the courage to talk to a neighbor he'd usually avoided and discovered she was raising 2 autistic children alone. He took a pie to her apartment one Sunday and stayed there for hours just listening. The invisible current Michael had started was expanding. It was as if the note had unlocked not only a new version of that man, but a new way of being in the world. He now understood that every act of generosity has the power to reverberate in waves that cross barriers, change paths, and save lives. Inspiration became action, and action multiplied. And all of this was born from a piece of paper with few words and a lot of soul. A few months later, he did something he never imagined. He created a small volunteer initiative called Napkins of Hope. He would pass by cafes and bakeries, writing motivational messages and discreetly leaving them on empty tables. Sometimes he'd write phrases like, "You are not alone," or "Life may hurt, but you are stronger than you think." He also began carrying ready-made notes with him, handing them out to strangers when he felt the need. And most surprisingly, he began receiving stories. People would find him on social media, commenting that they'd found one of those notes at just the right moment. Stories of tears, of reconciliation, of overcoming. The chain was becoming real, tangible, powerful. He was no longer just the man who received a message. He was now the link in a silent wisdom that encompassed empathy, understanding, and emotional intelligence. His life, once marked by pain and loneliness, now became a mission. And little did he know that destiny would reserve a new encounter for him, capable of closing a cycle with moving force. It was an ordinary autumn afternoon, and the dry leaves danced across the Brooklyn sidewalks as if discreetly celebrating the passing of time. The restaurant where it all began continued its usual routine. Laughter, hot dishes, the aroma of fresh coffee in the air. Michael once again was there. Age was beginning to leave its mark on his face, but his eyes retained the same serene glow as ever. He served with the same kindness, the same presence, the same awareness that each customer was a universe in motion. That was when the door opened and a man entered with firm steps, but his gaze gently moved. There was something familiar about him. His features were more lively, lighter. There was a sparkle in his eyes and a slight smile of someone who had known pain but chosen the path of overcoming it. Michael, upon seeing him, felt a strange flutter in his chest. It was as if he was seeing the reflection of a distant memory, vivid, but in a new form. They stared at each other for a few seconds, and with a simple gesture, the man took something from his pocket, a napkin, yellowed with age, carefully folded. Michael paused for a moment, holding a pitcher of water. There was no need to say anything. The connection was made without words. The customer approached the corner table, the same one he had sat at years ago, and invited the waiter to sit. He accepted, with the curiosity of someone who knows that life holds meaningful reunions. The man began to recount his journey since that day. He spoke of the moment he almost gave up on everything, the impact those words had, the series of choices that followed, the chain that grew from that gesture, and transformed dozens of other lives. Michael listened in silence, absorbing every detail with his heart. It wasn't vanity he felt, it was gratitude. The story he heard wasn't about himself, but about the power each person has to multiply. Good when they act with empathy, compassion, and courage. Here were two souls who recognized each other not by their names, but by the invisible bonds of genuine kindness. The reunion wasn't just physical. It was symbolic, emotional, and deeply spiritual. At the end of the story, the man stood and said, "You saved my life without knowing it, and today I do the same for others. I thought you should know." Michael stood, moved but restrained as he always was. They shook hands. It was a powerful gesture, filled with honesty, respect, and a kind of brotherly love that needed no name. In that moment, Michael felt complete. His journey, marked by so many ups and downs, had reached a point of peace. He wasn't seeking recognition, but receiving back proof that his gesture had blossomed brought a kind of silent reward that words can't describe. The reunion brought a feeling of reconciliation with the past and inspiration for the future. It was like seeing a seed he planted years before bear fruit before his eyes. And the most beautiful thing of all was that that fruit was now sowing new seeds. As the client said goodbye, Michael knew the story wasn't over yet. The impact of a gesture was just beginning to reveal its true consequences. After that remarkable reunion, the impact of Michael's gesture began to be understood even more deeply. The client, now transformed, became a true agent of hope. His project, Napkins of Hope, which had previously been a simple individual initiative, began to gain traction. He began to be invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even corporate events. He shared his story with vulnerability, without masks, allowing others to recognize themselves in his pain and transformation. His testimony inspired tears, reflections, and concrete actions. Young people with suicidal thoughts sought him out to say that his messages were what prevented them from committing something irreversible. Parents were reunited with their children. Couples in crisis were reunited. It was as if the energy of that initial gesture had multiplied into waves that touched thousands of hearts. And all of this was born from a single sentence written on a napkin, delivered with affection and guided by wisdom. Meanwhile, Michael continued his life at the restaurant, now fully aware that his mission had meaning. He didn't seek fame or the spotlight, but he felt a kind of peace that only those who act with purpose can know. His colleagues began to observe him differently. Many, previously skeptical, began to imitate him in small gestures. Some wrote thank you notes, others began to listen better to customers, and some even began volunteering at shelters on the weekends. A small, quiet revolution was underway. The restaurant's culture was transforming. Customers, even if they didn't know why, felt the different atmosphere. It was lighter, more human. There was an energy field built on generosity, empathy, and emotional intelligence. Michael had lit a light in that place, and now others were helping to keep it burning. The seemingly small gesture revealed itself as a seed of systemic change, a chain of good deeds that could never be measured in numbers, only in lives touched. The consequences also reached even deeper levels. Michael himself, realizing the impact of what he had done, rediscovered a dormant strength within himself. He decided to write a book recounting his own journey, blending stories from clients he had touched over the years. The book, titled Between Tables and Miracles, became a phenomenon among readers seeking meaning, humanity, and healing. He began to be invited to conversation circles, radio shows, and even podcast interviews. But above all, he continued serving tables with the same zeal. Because his essence was there in the direct contact, eye to eye, in the simple act of delivering a dish with kindness, the gesture not only transformed the customer's life, it transformed Michael. He understood that ultimately there is no small profession when it is acted with love. The story showed that an act of kindness, even when silent, can echo forever. And this echo would gain even more strength when the world knew what that napkin truly represented. The message written on the napkin has traversed time like an eternal whisper, echoing where least expected. It has become a symbol of a powerful and often forgotten truth. Words carry weight, and when used with love, respect, and understanding, they can rescue lives. What Michael wrote that day, driven by an intuition shaped by his own pain, was more than a charitable gesture. It was a turning point, and not just for the client who received the note, but for everyone who, directly or indirectly, was touched by that spark. The story spread through hallways, streets, and social media. It gained momentum, gained a voice, gained space. People who had never felt seen before began writing to each other. Teachers began leaving notes on the desks of apathetic students. Nurses left messages for lonely patients. Children left words of gratitude for their parents. Society, in its fragmented movement, welcomed small doses of genuine empathy as an antidote to indifference. The power of a message lies precisely in its simplicity. It wasn't about elaborate advice or motivational speeches. It was about words charged with intention, truth, and authenticity. Humanity yearns for connection, and that gesture demonstrated that, even in the modern chaos, there is still room for affection. The message contains something few have the courage to offer: presence, emotional presence, sensitivity, emotional intelligence in its purest form. It was a reminder that silence can often be broken by a single, well-placed sentence. That the invisible battles many face daily can be softened when someone cares enough to see, and more than see, to act. The world doesn't need grandiose heroes, but ordinary people willing to practice kindness in small doses. The power of that message came not from its complexity, but from the courage it gave. Because this is what true love is: action in the face of another's pain. Today, the napkin story has become a legend in many places. It's told in schools, replicated in videos, used as an example in leadership training, and even studied by researchers exploring the impact of human connection. But above all, it's remembered by those who were touched by it. Because a message like this isn't just read. It's felt, absorbed, and kept in the heart. Michael, the waiter who one day decided to write what he himself wished he had read years earlier, became a symbol of a silent virtue: initiative. He proved that true innovation isn't just in technology, but in the way we choose to relate to one another. The message he wrote was a seed, but the soil that received it, watered by gratitude and resilience, made it a forest of transformative gestures. And if there's anything this story teaches us, it's that each of us can be the author of a new narrative. All it takes is the courage to look at others with humanity and write, with sincerity, the next great message. And now tell me, how many times have you passed by someone who was falling apart inside and didn't even realize it? How many opportunities to be a bridge, not a wall, have you missed because you thought it wasn't for you? The truth is, every day we come across people fighting invisible battles, and most just need a sign, a note, a phrase, a look, something that says, "I see you and you matter." The world won't change with grand speeches. It changes when someone takes the initiative to act with kindness, even without guarantees of return. What about you? Are you willing to be that spark? Perhaps what's missing isn't more knowledge, but more compassion. How about writing a note today and leaving it in a public place? How about sending a sincere message to someone you know needs it? How about turning your pain into fuel to help someone get through theirs? With small acts of courage, you not only heal yourself, but become part of the world's healing. You don't need to change millions. You need to change one. And that, One can be the beginning of everything. If this story touched you, comment below how it affected you. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever received or delivered a message that made a difference? Share it with us. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and stay tuned. There's much more content like this coming. Because as long as there's pain in the world, there will be real stories ready to heal, transform, and inspire.